They didn't have a lot of range. They fell out of the sky quite frequently. But the U.S. Navy tolerated an insurgency of, we are going to inject aviation capabilities into fleet operations. We don't know where it will end up, but if somebody came up and said, oh my goodness, the airplanes can only carry a 100-pound bomb 100 miles, to which the aviator said, that's true. But as Christine said, they were able to envision a future in which they might carry a 500-pound bomb 300 nautical miles. And they tested, and they failed and failed and failed and failed. So injecting AI-enabled systems into in-place processes is very, very similar to that problem. And so that's why I am so optimistic. Look, the United States military is better at this than any other military in history. So all we got to do is let the operators go and give people like General Shanahan the support they need to support them, and away we go. So, as Eric said, we're extremely bullish on America. We're absolutely certain we can win this competition. All we have to do is say, hey, let's get after it.
Okay, next question. I don't know where it is. Pick one. Persistence.
Oh, okay. So thank you again all for being here. One thing that seems a consistent message is the need to be faster, but also the need to accommodate or circumvent the antibodies that come out in the Pentagon. So one thing that I would ask your thoughts on is you just mentioned aircraft and the interwar period, right? And there were a lot of mistakes and problems. The same thing will happen with AI, but AI is ultimately just software. It's software that serves a specific function. So if the department is not adept at doing software quickly, we won't be able to do AI quickly. When it comes to the bureaucracy and the processes, right now there's no concept of opportunity cost. So if you're the person responsible for authorizing systems in DoD, your default is to be mitigating as much risk as possible. And you don't incur any cost necessarily for being slow. How can we better align incentives so that people who are authorizing systems in DoD and the IC conceptualize of the opportunity cost or the cost of delay for the systems they're considering?
Who'd like to take that?
All right, I'll start.
Okay.
It's a great question, a complicated question. I think that the first step has been taken, which is a recognition that we need to get going. Now, the next step is much harder. And to me, a lot of it revolves around the whole idea of how we authorize that systems are ready, which gets to testing, which is where I think a lot of this lies. And so we need another one of my cultural shifts that I mentioned is in this notion of testing. Again, I think you want to think now of testing to build trust rather than testing to meet a predetermined criteria or standard. And that is a paradigm shift in the way that DoD acquires and fields its capabilities. But operators, to pick up on Bob's point, they're going to get that like that. They are constantly changing their tactics and their ways of operating to meet an emerging and changing threat. So they'll get that. We just got to get it to them. And that means a change in the way that we think about testing, the purpose of testing, and how much testing is enough. Those are hard questions. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But we're starting to do that work. The department is starting to do that work right now, and I think it will be key.
I found my experience at CIA leading large-scale change driven by technology adoption was two things. One was a lot of the antibodies were historically treated as outsiders and antibodies, not as partners. And so one of the things we did is we undertook a governance mechanism where we involved the antibodies up front to help us devise solutions. And part of it was raising their awareness of what really they were encountering, because a lot of it was based ill-informed assumptions that they had made. So involving them in driving to decisions that they were partners in and had investment in to get there. And we had pretty good success with that. The other one was helping them understand, really the collective understand and articulate what's the mission risk of not adapting. And that's something I don't think we do typically well, and certainly in the intelligence community, is when the cost of saying no is so low, and when we don't articulate well the cost of not moving faster or adapting faster, we tend to then err on the side of let the no's have it. And so we have to better articulate the mission risk of standing still, of being slow to adapt, and that's part of it. And so developing those more holistic risk decisions, I think, is key.
I just wanted to drop in one more point to underline something that Christine brought up. I think that AI is also slightly different from many of these other technologies in that it's more intimately involved with the decision-making process. And so one of the things that's key that's been highlighted by multiple of the panelists is there is this constant evolution of both the human user and how they use the software as well as the software. And so one of the questions that's an important one to look at is to think of not this is a release of a piece of hardware and then it's a very high bar to get another release of it a decade later, but more a co-evolution of the mission, the personnel, and the software, and we need to make that loop much tighter and a much lower barrier. And that's something that we've definitely experienced within NASA, where we have DevOps teams that are the same people who are developing the software, who are using the software in operations.
Yeah. I'd like to just make one last comment about this, because we've talked about how important leadership is in this sort of situation. And what I've seen in implementing change really for decades is that there's a small group in the front that sees the opportunity, and they know this is the right thing. And there's a sizable group here in the back who don't want to change. They're afraid. They're not patriots. They're actually concerned that you're going in the wrong direction. And there is a giant group in the middle that goes with who's ever winning. And one of the things that has to be done and continue to be done is to really make as much as can be transparent the early successes. And when you make these early successes widely known, the actual risk calculation changes, because people think that change is risky. And in fact, they think that fast change is riskier. And oftentimes, the actual opposite is true. And so the faster you change, the less risk. And by the way, it doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes. Mistakes will be made. However, if you've done them quickly, you have time to adjust. If you've waited out too long, you are out of time. Decisions are made for you. And this is true in all organizations. And so that's the kind of profile that I think of when I'm talking about implementing an important change. And can you think of a more important mission in our country than keeping our people safe? I can't. Okay. There's some back here. There's one over here. Okay.
Hello. I used to work on the Dragon 2 capsule at SpaceX, which is designed to be much more autonomous than all the previous spacecraft to bring people to the space station. And I'm wondering, that project has been delayed for years, and it seems really difficult to get past the really important but also really difficult testing processes required. And so I'm wondering, it seems logical to advocate that changing faster is better and has less risk. And the same thing is true of planes that went 100 and 500 miles. But there was a human toll to that I guess people got over during the Cold War. So I'm wondering, how do you balance a increasing risk aversion with systems like that with the necessity of building these autonomous systems to replace the last generation?
Bob, do you want to field that a little bit since you've had experience, or who'd like to?
Well, since it has to do with space and NASA,
Yes,
you know,
probably Steve.
yeah.
Sir.
Oddly enough, I'm going to answer that question generically. I think you have to study the problem and understand what the risks are. Everybody here probably manages their own retirement or some aspect of that. And there's this notion of inflationary risk. You can take all of your money and you can put it in the safest possible thing, but then you're doomed because inflation will wipe out all of your savings. We're in a global competition here. And if we do not move ahead, the risk is imperative. We understand what will happen if we do not move ahead. So we need to balance that, and we need to, first of all, we need to understand that there are quite a few areas where quite a few national security applications where we can introduce artificial intelligence without, having huge risk to human life. In the back end that Bob Work talked about, in terms of logistics, in terms of decision support, and in those key areas where there is significant risk to catastrophic loss of life, then of course we will proceed. We must proceed taking that into account.
Okay.
Thank you. So as a panel, you've touched on a lot of issues regarding cultural change and the need for moving faster, adopting commercialization. I'm wondering, based on, if you look at the trajectory of research in the academia and the private sector, a lot of it revolves on collaborating and open sourcing code and sharing benchmark data. And that's not traditionally how government agencies tend to operate when we're developing new technologies. It seems like secrecy might no longer be a competitive advantage for AI. As an example, back in February, OpenAI refused to release a model that they thought would be too dangerous, GPT-2. And within 4 months, 2 recent graduates developed a model that could replicate the results almost exactly. So it seems like there may no longer be a competitive advantage in hiding things, and maybe there are reasons to open source certain pieces of government work. I'm wondering how you view collaboration and the need for secrecy, and what frameworks government agencies should use to balance those interests.
Go ahead.
Go, you please.
So I think great question. I think the one I would agree with your premise, which is there's more we can do with open source and unclassified work, even in the intelligence community, and more of our work is actually in that space. Because at the end of the day, the risk of undertaking that work is somewhat offset, because if it's in the application of our tradecraft to unclassified either software development or other kinds of work, there's the attack surface is different, because it's not just about the technology, it's about how we apply it. And if we do actually adapt faster and become more of moving targets and embrace a much more quickly changing technological market, I got to think that we're going to be better than simply standing still with the illusion that we have with standing still with a classified system that may or may not be penetrated or may or may not be secure. That illusion has to go away. So I think it doesn't mean that we don't have still a fundamental role for classified work. Of course we do. But I think the proportion of the work that we're doing is more and more in the unclassified spaces, and it's about how we adapt that to the intelligence tradecraft, which will, I think, give us a great advantage. And when you look at the democratization of technology and data, that has to be increasingly on the open source side.
Just add on very quickly, I think collaboration is essential, and I tried to allude to this point in my remarks, that maybe we need to think a little bit differently about the classification of a piece of data versus the classification of a human understanding what that data means. They could be different. I don't know that they are, but I think we ought to think about it so that we can get the most out of all of the data that we have, and that does include collaboration. This point of secrecy, though, I think is very important, and I would just like to take the opportunity to plant the thought that we ought to also think strategically about what we choose to keep secret that we are doing in AI and what we choose to reveal. because understanding where the United States really is from a national security perspective in acquiring and pushing forward important new technologies like AI can have a very real effect on deterrence. But on the other hand, you might be giving something away. It's a hard set of decisions, but this whole reveal, conceal notion is a part of this secrecy conversation that I think we need to be having.
I just wanted to jump in and add one more point to that. So there's been a very active discussion in the artificial intelligence community on exactly what should the stance be towards some of these key technologies. And it's the view of some people, well, okay, so deep learning at its heart is a set of matrix multiplication, so you can't really protect that. And I would disagree very strongly with that. So it's been quite well understood. I'll make an analogy to nuclear weapons. It's been very well understood what the principles are to build nuclear weapons for quite some time, and it's been in the public domain. Any graduate student in X, Y, and Z knows that. But that doesn't mean that we don't choose particular key lines and key choke points to which we want to restrict technical know-how, and that's the kind of nuanced decision-making that we have to have the right people making decisions on in order to protect our national security.
And where this plays out inside the commission in a way is, again, we're moving towards trying to get to consensus recommendations, and we have these things called hard problems where we haven't come to a consensus yet. But there's a school of thought in AI research we should try to disentangle ourselves from China, who's our primary competitor in this field, or we should couple more closely with them. There have been people who have come and talked to the Commission on both sides of that equation. And the Commission is going to try over the course of the next year to thread the needle. But for example, all of the competitors want explainable AI. All of the competitors have high incentives to have good AI safety. All of the competitors have high incentives for good verification and validation regimes. We would never want to unentangle ourselves from the broader community to include our competitors if we can share that data, because we may use the AI differently. But it will be very, very good if all of us said we can trust the AI. You know, it's gone through this type of information. So the Commission, as I said, hasn't come to a consensus recommendation yet. But we're studying this problem very, very carefully.
Okay, I wish we could stay to take more questions, but I'm going to have to thank our panelists. This has been, for me, a very, very fascinating discussion. I want to let the audience know that we are going to take a 20-minute break, but don't go too far because lunch is offered just out here near the registration, and we're going to want you to bring your plate in here because we're not taking any time off here. We've got a panel at 11:50 that I think you're going to want to see here. It's going to be Lieutenant General Jake Shanahan from the Joint AI Center. It's going to be Kent Walker, VP of Global Affairs and Chief Legal Officer at Google, and it's going to be moderated by our Commission's Chairman, Eric Schmidt. So 20 minutes, grab lunch, come on back here. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to do a 10-minute delay so that everybody has time to get food. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your 5-minute warning.
If everyone could start to take your seats, please. The next panel will be starting soon. If everyone could please take your seats. Just a quick announcement. If everyone can please start to take your seats. We'll be starting the next panel in just a couple minutes. I'm told the mic's working, but no one's listening. If you could just please take your seats, we're going to start the next panel in just a moment or two. Dr. Schmidt will be moderating our lunch panel. It'll be on public-private partnerships. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're ready to start. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Schmidt, Mr. Walker, and General Shanahan.
I hope everyone had a good lunch or is busy finishing up an excellent lunch. I'm joined with two close friends of mine, and I'm probably the only person who can say this in the entire world. I work with and for both of them. So I want to make sure I disclose my conflict of interest to start with. So General Shanahan went to Michigan, Go Blue, ROTC, entered the service of our country in 1984. He's been promoted a gazillion times. He was in charge of a whole bunch of intelligence activities, a whole bunch of operational activities. And eventually, we needed somebody operationally to implement AI in the entire DoD, and he was the perfect choice. So I worked with him in my role as chairman of the DIB. Kent Walker was a federal prosecutor. Law and order federal prosecutor who then chose to come to Silicon Valley and actually I think worked at eBay for a while. And then we snagged him, we being Google, maybe 15 years ago? Coming on, yes. 15 years, spent every day together. And during that time, not only did he set up our legal function, but is now in charge of all of global policy, PR, all those sorts of things together. So very, very significant players. And what I thought we should do, since you all have heard from me plenty, is simply start, and perhaps, Kent, we should just have you make some comments about the world as you see it today.
Sure. So thank you very much, Eric. General Shanahan, it's a pleasure to be with you today and with all of you. The topic of today's panel, private-public partnerships, is extraordinarily important to me. I grew up in this community. My father was in the service for 24 years. I was born and spent the first years of my life on U.S. military bases. My father finished his career at Lockheed. So I feel a profound commitment to getting this right, to making sure that the private sector, the defense sector, and universities can work together in the best possible way. Before we jump into the thoughts on how we can accomplish that, I wanted to take on two issues up front. It's been frustrating to hear concerns around our commitment to national security and defense. And so I wanted to set the record straight on two issues. First, on China. In 2010, you may remember that Google was public about an attack on our infrastructure that originated in China. It was a sophisticated cyber security attack. We learned a lot from that experience. And while a number of our peer companies have significant commercial and AI operations in China, we have chosen to scope our operations there very carefully. Our focus is on advertising and on work supporting an open source platform. Second, with regard to the more general question of national security and our engagement in the Maven project, it is an area where it's right that we decided to press the reset button until we had an opportunity to develop our own set of AI principles, our own work with regard to internal standards and review processes. But that was a decision focused on a discrete contract, not a broader statement about our willingness or our history of working with the Department of Defense and the National Security Administration. We continue to do that. We are committed to doing that. And that work builds on a long tradition of work throughout the Valley on national security generally. It's important to remember that the history of the Valley, in large measure, builds on government technologies from radar to the internet to GPS to some of the work on autonomous vehicles and personal assistance that you're seeing now. Just in the last couple of weeks, we had an extraordinary accomplishment with regard to quantum supremacy, which moved forward the frontiers of science and technology. But that was not an achievement by Google alone. It built on research that had been done at the University of California in Santa Barbara. It benefited from extensive consultations with research scientists at NASA. It was carried out in many ways on supercomputers from the Department of Energy. So those kinds of exchanges and collaborations are really key to what has made American technological innovation as successful as it's been. And just as we feel as though we're contributing to the defense community, national security community, a lot of that work, that community is a part of Google. We have lots of vets who work at Google. We go above and beyond to make sure that reservists working at Google can complete their military service while having thriving careers. And even in our tools, we have tried to take steps to make sure that vets transitioning to civilian life can make the best use of their military skills in the private sector. As we do that, we also are fully engaged in a wide variety of work with different agencies. With the JAIC, we are working on a number of national mission initiatives, from cybersecurity to healthcare to business automation. With DARPA, we are working on a number of fundamental projects to ensure the robustness of AI, to identify deep fakes, and to progress work on the end of Moore's Law and how to progress the operation of hardware and use software-hardware interfaces in better ways. So as we take on those kinds of things, we're eager to do more. We are pursuing actively additional certifications that will allow us to more fully engage across a range of these different topic areas. And we think that's extremely important. At the same time, we think there's a great partnership to be had on the work that the DIB has announced in the last week, their AI principles, which were, I thought, very well done. It's a lengthy document, but a thoughtful document, and really continues the work, the groundwork that was laid by the Department of Defense back in, I think it was 2012, with Directive 3009, which talked about the use of human judgment in the application of advanced technologies, the charter of the JAIC, the work that DoD has done with its own AI principles. And the private sector, we too have been trying to drive forward on this. We have not only put out principles in very common and overlapping areas. There's a lot in common in these questions. Safety, human judgment, accountability, explainability, fairness are all critical areas where different actors in the space each have different things to contribute. And I think that's critically important. This is a shared responsibility to get this right. As the DIB report notes, we need a global framework. We need a global approach to these issues. Endorsing the OECD framework around these issues is extremely important and something that we want to support. And we are working together to figure out where are there complementarities. Because at the end of the day, we are a proud American company. We are committed to the defense of the United States, our allies, and the safety and security of the world. We are eager to continue this work and think about places we can work together to build on each other's strengths.
Well, thank you, Kent. General, take us through what you're up to at the JAIC.
Well, so first of all, let me say thanks. It is great to be here, and I thank both Eric and Kent for the opportunity to do this. Admittedly, though, I will say I'm a poor substitute for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, although I say it's a lower probability of any headline-grabbing soundbite, so you get that with it. And I also confess this is undoubtedly the first and last time I will serve as a warm-up act for Dr. Henry Kissinger, but hang on for the main event, as I say. I not only welcome, but I relish the opportunity to have this broader conversation about public-private partnerships. And when you ask me to reflect back on my 2 years as the director of Project Maven and just about a year in the seat as the director of the JAIC, there's one overarching theme that continues to resonate strongly with me. It's the importance, and I would say the necessity, of strengthening bonds between government, industry, and academia. This was said this morning. You brought it up, and others had also mentioned it, is this idea of this relationship should be depicted as a triangle, and it actually should be in the form of an equilateral triangle, government, academia, and industry. I would suggest that that's largely the form it did take beginning in the 1950s and largely lasting until the early part of this decade. Walter Isaacson writes about this very eloquently and powerfully in his book, The Innovators. It is what really drove to Silicon Valley today. It's not the case today. At best, the sides of the triangle are no longer equidistant. You might even say they are distorted or a little frayed, in addition to being of different lengths. The reasons for that are complex and they're multifold. Snowden, Apple encryption, mismatched operating tempo and agility, different business models, general mistrust between the government and industry. We started talking past each other instead of with each other. The task is made much more difficult today by the fact that industry is moving so much faster than the Department of Defense, in fact, the rest of government, when it comes to the adoption and integration of AI. We're playing perpetual catch-up. And some employees in the tech industry see no compelling reason to work with the Department of Defense. And even those who want to work with DoD, which I say is far more than sometimes is portrayed, I say put everybody in this room in that category, we don't make it easy for them. So I would just reinforce some of the themes that are in the Security Committee